Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Trusting News webinar as part of U.S. Democracy Day 2023. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. My name is Joe Amditis. I am Assistant Director for Products and Events here at the Center, and I'm excited to be joined by two fantastic panelists who are going to be leading us today. Before I introduce and bring our panelists up on stage to introduce themselves, just some quick overview of how this is going to work today. We have a solid 1 hour and maybe 15-minute webinar today for you prepared. You'll be interacting with our panelists and the rest of the attendees in the chat, as you're very well used to by this point. If you have any issues or any problems, you can DM me in Zoom right here. Just click on my name or click the little drop down above the chat bubble, select me, and then we can try to sort you out. This is being recorded, and you will receive a recording as well as a recap email with the slides and other resources and links, not only about Democracy Day, but about the topics and issues that Joy and Lynn, our two panelists, discuss throughout. Again, open conversation here. Feel free to drop comments, questions, thoughts in the chat. Let's keep it lively. Use your reaction button down here if you'd like to raise your hand and ask a question. We'll try to get to you within reason and in the order that you raised your hand. And with that, I will go ahead and bring our two amazing panelists up on stage here. We're going to be joined by Joy Mayer and Lynn Walsh of Trusting News. Joy is the director and Lynn is the assistant director of Trusting News. Joy, Lynn, do you want to take it away and tell us who you are and go for it?
Thank you. Yes. Hello, everyone. It is great to see you. I will get my screen sharing going here. So I'm Joy Mayer. I am the director of Trusting News, and we are thrilled to be once again partnering with Democracy Day and bringing you some strategies we hope can help as you think about how to demonstrate to your audience your commitment and mission behind covering government and democracy. So at Trusting News, we have been figuring out as much as we can since 2016 about how people decide what news to trust and training journalists and empowering journalists to actively demonstrate credibility and earn trust day to day. I am Joy. I'm the director. I'm based in Sarasota, Florida. And I'll let my colleague introduce herself.
Yes, hello everyone. Lynn Walsh, I'm the assistant director at Trusting News, based in San Diego and upstate New York. And as Joy said, excited to bring you some of these tips that we've been working with journalists for several years now, specifically related to democracy, politics, and covering elections. Please feel free to use the chat as we go along today. Both of us will be monitoring it and also sharing links. So thanks so much. And we're here to hopefully teach you a lot and also answer some questions.
So today we're going to talk just a little bit about where we're coming from at Trusting News as we approach this topic. We're going to talk about how you can sort of collect and study the questions your audience has about the ways that you cover democracy and elections. We'll talk about how to answer those questions in a way that makes sense to your audience and that feels comprehensible to them. We'll talk about one of our favorite strategies, which is creating a really simple FAQ to collect those answers, and then how you repeatedly send people to those answers so that as your audience is learning about what you cover, they're also learning about you and how you do it. So we will answer some questions throughout the presentation, and we'll also save time at the end. So store them up or stick them in the chat as you go. So a few basics about how we work at Trusting News. Some principles. We definitely encourage you to remember that you cannot persuade everyone to trust you. That's not reasonable. It's also not accurate because not all journalism is trustworthy. So we focus our efforts on the people who are reachable, who are persuadable, who are operating in good faith. And I invite you to keep in mind that section of your audience as we talk today. Another basic principle of ours is that being a news consumer is really confusing and exhausting, and that most people have a casual relationship with the news. So as much as we wish people were making bulleted lists of which news source is trustworthy and why, they're often consuming news ambiently. They're overwhelmed by how many places they could turn for information, and they are eager for signals that help them cut through the noise. We also believe strongly that there are problems on both sides of this broken relationship, that we could absolutely make a list of all of the things we wish the public would do differently as they consume the news. And there are ways we as journalists can guide them to do that, but that fundamentally, The crisis of trusted news is one that is existential for us. It affects our ability to serve the public. It affects our ability to stay in business. And it, of course, affects our ability as communities to self-govern. Two more principles. Really important to remember that the idea that we should not trust everything we read, see, or hear is true. And that people being skeptical of information is actually a really good thing. And we as journalists are really skeptical beings ourselves. So our job is not to tell people that journalism as a whole is trustworthy. Our job is to differentiate our own work and demonstrate what makes our work credible and worthy of people's trust. And then the last principle here is we do not get credit for any decisions or ethics that are invisible to the audience. So anytime we spend thoughtfully considering how much attention to give a story, how to fairly cover all the candidates in a race, or whether covering all candidates in a race is really what we want to do, whether how we cover threats to democracy, what photo we should run, what headline feels the most fair. All of that is invisible to the audience unless we describe it. So the ways that we feel really good about our integrity and our thoughtfulness in our coverage decisions, we don't get credit for those, nor should we, unless we talk about them, because they're not something people can take for granted. So it's especially bad if trust in the news is low for journalists and for this democratic republic that we are attempting to keep going in this wonderful, messy experiment. So we can wish that people trusted us, which is not very effective, or we can get busy earning trust. And so that's what we do at Trusting News, is turn that feeling of discouragement and turn the wishes into actual strategies. So there's a lot that we need as an industry to think about when it comes to earning trust. We need to think about better listening and understanding of audience mistrust. Hard to solve a problem you don't fully understand. We need a lot more humility in journalism about how we could provide more respectful and nuanced coverage of diverse communities. There's a lot we miss. There's a lot we get wrong. There are times we cause harm, and we need a lot more humility about that. We need to really invest in continual feedback loops and really investigating audience curiosities and priorities. Today, we're going to focus on some specific things we need: how we clear up misassumptions about journalism, how we demystify our processes and our mission, and also how we explain our ethics and integrity, both proactively, getting on the record ahead of time to clear things up, and also defensively, when we see there are attacks on our integrity, what do we do about it? So I'm going to kick it over to Lynn to get us started.
Yeah, so the first thing we're going to talk about is how you can uncover the questions your audience has about your journalism. And so why this is important is because what we have learned at Trusting News and what other trust research shows as well is when people do not understand the journalistic process, they're going to make an assumption about how you're doing your work, why you're doing your work, why you're focusing on certain things. And when they do that, most of the time, that assumption is going to be negative. They're not giving you credit for all the important decisions you're making. And so what we want to do is kind of think about, what do they need to know? What do we want them to know? Or what questions do they have? And so how are you going to do that? Well, one basic thing you can do is ask them. You may think, wow, that seems too basic. How that seems too easy. Well, you can do this in different ways. We have newsrooms do this with surveys. You might do this in person. You might do this with embedded feedback forms. And one example of this is something that the Seattle Times investigative team did. So they wanted to build trust with specifically their investigative coverage, but also share more just about how the process works. So what they did is they asked their audience. They said, basic question, what do you want to know about how we do investigative journalism? And when they did that, they embedded the form on stories. They also shared it on social media. And when they did that, they got a lot of responses. They actually were surprised by how many different responses they got. The responses turned into about 60 plus questions. And we worked with the investigative team on this. What they did is they took those 60 questions and they kind of grouped them into common themes. And then they decided, okay, which ones are we going to answer? And so some of those questions they heard were, how do you prioritize which topics to investigate? Are you politically biased? I'm sure this is one you probably have heard. One that was particularly, I think, interesting, and I'm glad that they did decide to answer, even though it was a difficult one to talk about for them. How does your mostly white team authentically represent and report on communities of color? Who actually discusses and decides on big stories? How many investigators are involved? So they decided out of those 60 questions, after grouping them, finding commonalities, they decided to answer about 8 to 10 of those. And what they did is they published basically an FAQ. It was a page that lived on its own that answered some of those questions. Now, when you clicked on each of these, it had an explanation. How they did this as a team is Taylor Blatchford was the person who kind of organized all of this, and she does engagement strategy and media, a lot of social work and social engagement for the investigative team. But then the members of the team, the investigative reporters, the investigative producers, all took turns answering the questions and adding feedback. So then they also share some of these answers on social, in a newsletter, and within stories their investigative team does. So that's just one way, again, having that embedded feedback form that you can do that. Another strategy, you can keep track of what you wish people knew. Now, remember, when we're thinking about this, people a lot of times are not just going to come out and tell you, I wish I knew how you did this, or I wish I knew how you did that. Instead, unfortunately, it probably will come across as maybe a complaint or a criticism. And so what we like to say is you want to turn those complaints or criticisms, those assumptions, into information gaps. What does a negative comment indicate someone doesn't understand about you? So when someone makes an assumption or says that you only cover Republicans or you only cover Democrats or you're part of the liberal media, well, the goal is take that complaint and think, what can I explain that may help this person better understand our intention and that that's not true? Now, with all of this, I will say you're not going to be able to convince everyone, but we do know that this can work. And it's good if you kind of get ahead of it and kind of anticipate what that is before doing it afterward, although after is fine as well. So 2 examples of kind of how you can turn those complaints into an information gap. This first example, the complaint, which maybe you have heard, you're only writing about the health violations at this restaurant because you're out to get them. Cut them a break. Maybe you hear this about elected officials. You're only covering them because you don't want them to win or you don't like them. Quit picking on them. Why do you always have to put people down? Well, instead, you could turn that into the information gap to explain, why do journalists find it important to share stories about public health, even if they negatively affect a local business? And so that's the question, the information gap. You answer that question. The same would go to if someone said, why are you always covering this politician? You could explain your approach to covering politicians. Another example, the complaint may be you cover this candidate more because you want her to win. Well, the information gap there, the question you could answer and explain is, how do journalists decide which races and candidates to focus coverage on? This is something for each newsroom that's going to be a little different. It's going to depend on how many resources you have, how many races you have to cover, what type of election it is. Be open and be transparent and willing to explain those things so people can have a better understanding of how this works. So then they don't make an assumption that you're only covering the candidate because you want her to win.
So let's talk about what you do when you have the questions and how to answer them in a way that makes sense to people and that also assumes some good faith. As Lynn said, some of the people throwing those accusations at you are not operating in good faith. They're not going to believe you no matter what you say about the reasons behind your work, but some will. And especially if the question is being asked publicly, you have a chance to get on the record in response instead of letting them have the last word about your integrity. You can get on the record in response, and you're also then reaching people besides the person who asked the question. So anytime you get a window into what people don't understand is an opportunity to think, oh, I bet other people wonder this as well. How can we explain it? So here, I'm going to click through a bunch of examples of what that can look like. And when we share the slides after the webinar, you will have examples to each of these as well. There will be links in the notes field in the Slack. So when we think about the big question of things that might come up about your coverage of democracy, how do you decide what to cover? Who makes decisions about coverage? Is it like a corporate boss? Is it somebody local? Which races or issues will you focus on? How do you fact check? How do you work to be fair? Man, this is when I wish a lot more newsrooms would articulate. What does it look like to be fair in your reporting? What does it mean to be independent? These are things that we tend to throw out as if just saying we work hard to be fair and independent is the last word, when in fact, I'm not sure. What does that mean? What does being nonpartisan mean in our day-to-day coverage? So here are some examples of what that can look like. I want you to think about the language and tone and writing style of these, how approachable they feel, and also start to think about where in your systems these could go. And we will share examples in a minute about how to sort of collect some of these answers in one place. So think about your standards of fairness. This is an example from a PolitiFact newsletter. They say we don't try to make either party or any particular politician look bad or good. We work hard to hold everyone accountable to the same basic set of standards. We do tend to fact check provocative statements that sound wrong. So if some people get fact checked more, that might be why. Think about the question of giving equal treatment to multiple candidates. This is an example from WCPO in Cincinnati. They, think about the meetings that we have in newsrooms. When their newsroom team said, when a candidate comes to town and has a rally, will we always preempt primetime coverage? What will we do on our website? Will we live stream on social? It's exactly the kind of conversations that newsrooms have all the time and often don't end up sharing. So they just said, if we're going to do it consistently, how can we explain that to our audience? They said, when a candidate comes to visit, we will live stream on Facebook. We will cover the right stories, produce stories about what the candidate says. We'll provide coverage of the issues surrounding the visit and traffic, that sort of thing. We will not air the entire events live on TV. And one thing that their team found when doing this is that once you're on the record, you can then link back to this explanation when you get questions. So soon after this, they had a Facebook comment saying, why aren't you covering Bernie's rally when he was elsewhere in the country? And they were able to say, when people, we don't do that this way. When people come to town, here's how we're going to handle it. They're already on the record. So responding to the accusation or the complaint or the question is much easier if you're already on the record about how you will handle it. A few other excerpts from that WCPO example. We need to treat all of the candidates, all 26 of them, equally, which may or may not be every newsroom's approach. We don't want to just cover speech after speech. And then they have a little bit of a sort of humility or behind some personality, some humanity is the way they write about it. We know this is a controversial decision. We wanted to let you know we took great care and trying to make a fair decision for our community. It's important to note that this decision was made by journalists who live and work here in Cincinnati. It was not a shot called by our corporate office or in any network office. That's actually something, if that's not something you have talked about at your news organization, who makes decisions, I encourage you to think about that. We did some focus groups later with viewers of WCPO and invited them to come to morning news meetings and asked them before and after what they thought about the news and how it was made. These were people with low trust in news. Before and after they watched a news meeting take place. And one of their key takeaways was actually, they did not realize that these local people in Cincinnati were the ones making the decision. They actually kind of assumed that it was corporate bosses somewhere else. We know that a lot of the newsrooms we work with get a lot of questions about the syndicated coverage they provide, the wire service coverage they provide. In some newsrooms, they say that a lot of the complaints that they have in local newsrooms are actually about national stories. We've heard this from several of our partners, that the sort of the tone or the focus of the national stories is something people notice. Sometimes it seems like this sort of coastal big city perspective that's embedded in those stories is something that local communities notice and have negative reactions to. In some cases, we've heard people say things like, oh, well, you must be owned by the Washington Post because you're running Washington Post stories. So there's just a lot of confusion about that. But any service, any content that we produce under our umbrella or that we share and publish under our umbrella, it's reasonable for our audience, the people who have a relationship with us, to hold us accountable for that coverage, or at least to ask us to expect an explanation about it. So this is one of our newsroom partners in Oklahoma, put this in a column about why they run Associated Press stories. We think it's important to help you stay up to date on national and world news. We have found the journalism produced by the not-for-profit news cooperative in general to be consistent with our standards. Here's what some research was about perceptions of bias in the AP and how they rated pretty highly. So I wonder if this is the kind of thing that we often find newsrooms are not on the record about, that they sort of take for granted that people understand. And it's a good time, especially heading into another election year, if you use state and national coverage to round out to complement local coverage. Explaining how and why you do that is something we're very interested in. Here's an example we have a couple examples here from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution of the way that they talk about how they cover government. This is the first one. They have a piece that they update that with a headline, "How the AJC Covers the Georgia Legislature." And I wanted to highlight these two separate paragraphs from that piece. They actually explain in much more basic language than I'm used to seeing. Both chambers of the legislature are controlled by Republicans, and the governor and other statewide leaders are also Republicans. That means their issues and bills have a greater chance of becoming law, so we typically write more stories about them. When Democrats controlled the legislature before 2003, the reverse was true. I think that's really interesting and very direct. And this other paragraph says, "Our scrutiny of elected officials is not based on personal political views or preferences, but on our responsibility to make sure Georgians know what's going on. As a team of professionals, we hold each other accountable for being even-handed and fair." I would love to see that teased out some more even. What does that mean, being even-handed and fair? What does that look like? What are the types of questions we ask each other on staff to see if we think that that is the case from story to story? The AJC's ethics policy includes this line about what it means to be independent. We avoid relationships that could cause our audience to question our integrity or credibility. We avoid conflict of interest and obligations to those who seek to influence the news. We disclose any conflicts that are not avoidable. We make news decisions independently without outside influence. We do not accept gifts, favors, or compensation from those whom we cover. So in an ideal world, this is a great thing to have in your ethics policy. In an ideal world, readers would understand what that looks like day to day. I would love to see boxes with stories, editor's notes, inline comments within stories that say things like, "In accordance with our ethics policy, we're disclosing this," and linking back to this section. I would like to see news organizations bring the receipts for policies like this. What does it mean? What does it look like in your day-to-day coverage? What does this mean for you day to day? And where is the evidence that this is actually what you're following and holding yourself, the standard you're holding yourself to? This is an example from WITF in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. They have this language about being independent from the influence of funders. They say a large and diverse group of funders supports our work, including many individuals, businesses, government entities, and foundations. Most of the funding and underwriting we receive supports overall operations. A diversity of sources, the number of contributors, and the unrestricted character of funds all reinforce the independence and integrity. So this is another good example of how it's wonderful to be on the record as a whole. And then with individual stories, some of these organizations have a habit of disclosing when they are covering someone who is also, or an organization who has also given them money. Once you're on the record with this, it's the kind of thing you can easily link back to from within stories. In accordance with our ethics policy, here's how our funding works. This is an example of another TV station, KCRG, explaining that their editorial decisions are made locally. All of the news and content decisions are made here based on what is best for our audience. At the heart of KCRG TV is the people here who are part of the same communities we cover and serve with information that is not the only thing that drives our news coverage. Not once has anyone from Gray TV told us what KCRG TV should cover or not cover or how to report it. Let's talk about polling for a minute. I find that news organizations don't say as much as I wish that they did about how they cover polls, whether they conduct polls themselves, and how they decide which political polls to cover. I think it's really rational for the public to be skeptical of polling at this point, to kind of take it all with a grain of salt, also to assume that there is, of course it's reasonable to think that there's money that drives polls, and that polls, they're not all held to the same standard of independence or fairness or integrity in terms of what the data finds and how they're operated and how valid they are. So I think it's important to get on the record. So this is the kind of thing that PolitiFact will sometimes leave the first comment under a story or respond to social comments with an explanation like this. We go out of our way to seek varying polls with different points of funding so that we can consider every angle. This is a follow-up to a story about Nancy Pelosi. And then they have a link that explains the facts that the the data and the sources that they typically trust for political polling. The AJC did a story, they conduct their own polling. And so they had a really fantastic story about why this is then the lead up to the 2020 election, how they conduct polling and why they conduct polling. I think it's important to remember that not everyone is real literate about these sort of things. Not everyone pays really close attention, and explaining what polling is meant to do and what it isn't meant to do in really clear language can be so fantastic. So this says, this poll is intended to provide a snapshot of how Georgia voters feel 1 year out about the top candidates and their issues. It is not a prediction of who will win. It is simply a baseline picture of where things stand right now. We're going to do several of these polls, just a moment in time thing, right? I love this next paragraph as well. It's important to note that polling is just a small part of how the AJC covers elections. We have been writing about major issues such as XYZ. We're covering how the candidates are reaching out to voters. We investigate their records. There's a lot to do with our coverage, and this polling is just one piece of it. So this is the kind of thing of, if you have a headline on your website, why we do political polling, then you're able to link back to that each time someone has a question. That can happen in an email. It can happen in a social comment. It can happen within a story as a reminder, here's how and why we conduct political polling. It's the kind of thing you should routinely, repetitively even, remind your audience about. One more example from the AJC, Susan Potter, who's a government editor there, in responding to some questions when publishing a big investigation and responding to some questions, I liked this explanation that she shared. It's the AJC's job to document the history of our state. It's also our job to shine a light on the actions of officials who work to change the outcome of a historic election, and sow suspicion that persists to this day about the integrity of elections in Georgia. When your staff is in the habit of explaining your work, this kind of thing is easier to do. And it's also something you can link back to when people say, why are you covering this? Or when they make, as Lynn said, when people don't understand how you operate, they don't give you the benefit of the doubt. And so providing them with language to understand, getting on the record about it yourself is important.
Thanks. And the example Joy just showed with AJC, it's actually something they came out and, Georgia, a spot where the election integrity, like other places, was a very big story. And there were people on very polarizing sides of the issue. They thought very carefully before publishing this content that dove very deeply into how people were trying to discredit the election results and all the players involved. And they added notes to all of the content, created timelines, really thought carefully about how to explain their intentions on every piece of content and every time they shared it on social. And so it's just a good example of thinking ahead about how polarizing topic, how can we explain our intentions? And again, not everyone is going to maybe believe it, or you're not going to convince everyone, but can you at least explain it for some of those people who maybe, so they don't make that misassumption. So now we're going to talk about how you are going to actually create an FAQ and what this looks like. And I want to, before I show some examples of how newsrooms have done it, there was a question in the chat about, do people click on these FAQs and how often are they open? So this is something that's really important, because something we talk about a lot at Trusting News is when you're adding transparency elements, you're talking about these types of decisions you're making, your ethics, you are doing it on something that is like your brand, so an about page, an FAQ page, but you also really absolutely have to attach it to the daily stories. If you do not, it is less likely that people are going to be clicking on these pages. Some of your most dedicated users, or maybe your people who are the most skeptical, are going to find these pages. They're going to click on them. But if you are not sharing them regularly and embedding them into stories, either with a note on the top or sharing them elsewhere on social, they are not going to get clicked on that much. You have to grab people's attention where it is. And so that's kind of to answer that question. And if there's more to that, feel free to put more in the chat. We can address it during the Q&A. So creating an FAQ. Here's one example of how one newsroom did this. This is Colorado Public Radio. And they basically they listed a set of questions. And when you click on each question, there is an answer. They also have this down here where it says, do you have a question we haven't answered? Let us know. So they were continuing to take feedback and get questions from people that they could add to this if they wanted to. And so some of those questions that they decided to answer, what's our coverage mission? How are we planning to cover the entire state? How do we select sources for stories? One of the best things about this FAQ is they took the time right off the top to explain their mission. And so when they were explaining their mission, they explained how their mission, and they came out and used language that is similar to how people would discuss kind of having an agenda. They said their mission is to serve all Coloradoans, not a partisan sliver. And as the election approaches, we wanted to explain more thoroughly what we're doing to earn your trust every day. So this is really great because you're saying, here's what our mission is. Here's why we're explaining this. And then they list those questions and links to each, which accomplishes two things. It lets the reader on the page skip to the section they're interested in. It also allows the staff to use the link to the answer to the specific question to share on social, to respond to people in comments if it pops up, which is a great tool because, again, yes, these pages are good. Some people are going to find them, but it's going to be less likely that they find them unless you're adding this and using it in your day-to-day coverage. So look at some of those answers to some of the questions that they explained. So one of the questions was related to source selection, and they explained how the reporters are always expanding their source database. They look for sources who are experts when the story calls for that. They look for sources across a wide range of attributes. They also say the most important consideration for a source is their importance to explaining an issue and helping them achieve that goal of factual, fair reporting. The next explanation that they have is on how they decide what to cover. This is a question, whether it's related to politics or anything that you're covering. A lot of people make assumptions about your story selection, either what you don't cover, what you cover all the time, what you spend a lot of time covering. They are going to make assumptions about that depending on their feelings on those topics. And so it is so important to get on the record about what influences those decisions. And so related to this, they said the questions we ask when deciding what to cover include, does this affect actual people? How and how many? Does this help Coloradoans understand each other? Does it help them understand the issues they will have to decide on? And then they also say they have, as a newsroom, set long-term priorities in all of their coverage, including elections, which helps keep them focused on diving deep in some areas and saying no to others. The next question, one of the other questions they answered, was how they balance the coverage between political parties. This is always an important one. You saw a little bit of that explained in some of the examples that Joy was talking about from WCPO and from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. But they decided to answer the question in their FAQ, and they talk about how they don't have a running count to make sure you have this number of stories about Republicans and a matching number about Democrats. Instead, they ask each other questions, the reporters and the editors. Have we presented this issue fairly? If they feel they've missed a perspective, they say they will find a way to get it to you before you read or hear the story. This is my favorite part about this explanation, though. They say, that said, we are human. And when our readers and listeners draw our attention to something we overlooked, that sometimes leads to further coverage of an issue. With all of this, when you're creating these FAQs, I just cannot stress it enough. These should be looked at as a way to make your journalism better, to share and explain more about what your process is. But it's absolutely okay also to say that you're not perfect. We are not perfect. We want to always be improving. And so adding that type of language and then asking for community feedback to help with that is so, so important, because that's how we are going to get better and cover some of these topics in a more concise and kind of equal way for everyone in our community. Here's another example of how an FAQ is laid out. This one is the Texas Tribune. And so they took a similar approach in that they did it kind of FAQ style with answering several questions. What I really love about this, though, is more their layout and some of the things that it allows for the reader to do, but also the journalist to do. When you click on these links, you actually can share specifically that section when you are sharing it on social. And this is something, again, if we want people to see these, how are we sharing them? How are we inserting them into our daily coverage? And here's just an example of this embed. Then they also put into stories, political stories. They were actually able to embed into stories this box that then when you click on it could link you back to the main FAQ, but then also have the explanation right in the story. Because again, we want to gain people's attention where we have it. The most important thing with all of this is you want to pick a way to get on the record that's going to work for your team. The other thing I always like to tell newsrooms that we work with too, these FAQ pages, they do not have to be all encompassing before you publish. When I've helped newsrooms do this, I have them make a list of questions out, and then they make different deadlines for who and assign who's going to answer it. It's okay if they're not ready all at once. Maybe you publish the FAQ and you have answers to 3 questions. Then you add a 4th, then you add a 5th. Do not let perfection or answering all of the questions get in the way. If you do, you will never publish the FAQ because there's always more questions potentially that can pop up. And it's also really great to have kind of share the responsibility across different reporters and editors. Here's one other example. This is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution again. This is a little different in that it was very specific to one election that was a mayoral race a couple years ago. And so instead of taking an FAQ approach, they explained the same things, but did it with different photos. They did it with different kind of blocks of text that they included. They talked about their commitment to the election, how they're going to cover the race. This right there is a photo of the journalists who are covering the race. They also included a couple other elements that basically outlined what a mayor does. Again, that may sound silly, but how often do you see lawmakers make promises and you're like, they can't even do that in that position. That's actually not even something that position does. Well, people don't necessarily know that. So by spelling out, here's what a mayor can do, here's what they can't do, here's how much money they make, all of those things can be really, really helpful to voters as we're trying to help them make decisions when they are in the ballot box.
One nice thing about an FAQ as opposed to things that are on your About Us page or your ethics page or pages like this is that it can feel easier to update them. You can even have a line that like you would do on a Dateline sometimes that says last updated on this date. You can add to it, as Lynn was saying. It feels a little bit less formal and more iterative. Lynn, there's a question in the chat that I wonder if we could pause for a minute and address. Bernardo said, what do you think about papers explaining their investigations? Like we see papers like the Tampa Bay Times and ProPublica do this a lot where they'll have kind of a column explaining the investigation. And I think that is, I just wanted to jump in for a second and address that. It is so helpful to say, here's why we're investing all these resources in this. Here's the process we went through, the main questions we were trying to answer. Something that ProPublica does especially well is link to that prominently from within the investigation itself, so that anytime somebody pulls up the investigation, they're invited to also see that explanation. They also will include some of the language from the explanation in the story itself. Here's something we want you to know about how we did this. To read more, go to this other link. Way too often, those explanations are produced so separately and might exist even under like an opinion umbrella, editor's column or something, and they're just not something people are going to find. And so the impact of them is wasted or at least lessened because they are. If you look at the page views, they're just not something that's found. Or there will be a link on an investigations page that says, read how we did this investigation here without any supporting, no preview, like give me a sentence or two about it and give me something to whet my appetite. Most people are not showing up to journalism saying, I wonder how and why they did this today, right? They are curious if there's something especially interesting, or if they're mad, right? Or if they really, really love it. They have to have some strong feelings about it before they care about that behind the scenes. So that is, I think, writing a separate column and not giving people reason and ease of finding it is problematic.
I stopped your screen share while you two were talking, so you have to pop it back up again. Sorry about that.
Thank you. No problem.
And as Joy's doing that, one thing just to reiterate is with that, the language is really important. As Joy said, just saying, here's how we did this. Well, what are you explaining in that? Are you talking about sourcing? Are you talking about where you got your information from? Are you talking about how you picked the sources, how you tried to be fair? Getting very, very specific is really important when you're sharing it day to day and when you're writing the explainer itself.
All right. So there are a lot of good questions coming through. We have just one more section of examples to share, and then we will have plenty of time for questions. So Lynn, as you dive back in there, feel free to interrupt me or pause me, or Joe as well, if you think there's something we should be jumping right on. But I want to just drill down on the point Lynn was just making about the ways that we point people to those answers. So many CMSs will allow this simple technology, often known as the anchor tag, that is making a section on a page linkable. So instead of just sending people to a page, you're sending people to a specific part of a page. So that is what we mean with that Colorado Public Radio and the Texas Tribune both. When there's a little link symbol next to a headline, that means you can link directly to that part. So if somebody on social media says, you only cover political polling when it's favorable to this candidate, and you have in your FAQ answered the question of here is how we use political polls and which ones we trust and what consistency and integrity you can expect behind that process, then you can link directly to that. Very, very often when it comes to transparency like this, what we hear from journalists is that, or what we see happening in newsrooms, is that they will do all the work of getting on the record and remember to link to it for a few days. And think, oh, we told people that yesterday. I don't know if we need to tell them that again. It's why we're such fans of that Texas Tribune embed, because it's just a habit then with all stories that relate to the ways we cover this election. We're going to send people back to the answers of how and why we do it. So I want to show you some examples of what it can look like to drive people back to your explanation once you're on the record. So Colorado Public Radio does a lot of these explainer type pieces. And this is actually a good example, Bernardo, of driving people back to an explanation about why you're investigating something. It says, we've spent months talking with teenagers, parents, doctors, advocates, and political figures. We've looked through, they were investing in one topic heavily. And in order to get people back to this column at the bottom that says we're publishing a series about tobacco in Colorado, here's why. The above editor's note is the kind of thing that they put in stories that were related to that on an ongoing basis, not just we're going to publish 3 stories and we're going to make sure that each of these 3 stories has a link back to why we're doing it. Every time they add to more coverage about this, they're able to say, here's why we're investing such resources here. It's about ethics, optics, and equity. I love that. So no matter what your CMS is able to do in terms of boxes with stories, in terms of like sort of transparency elements, we've seen some really great examples being developed of swipe through or click through little boxes in the middle of stories that explain who the reporters are, or the ethics policies, or the policy on anonymous sources, or things like that. No matter what your CMS will let you do, there are some like McClatchy and Hirsch that'll have expandable boxes that you can put kind of behind the scenes in the middle of stories. No matter if none of that is available to you, an editor's note in italics at the top of the story is probably something you can manage. So just a few examples of where else to take your information. After the Seattle Times, the example we showed you at the beginning about their investigative team, after they wrote answers to some of the questions, they took short versions of that to social. So this is just, and I love that they have bylines with them. Like, here's who wrote this part, so that you can connect through there. So you can click through from each of these back to the full FAQ, but they took some of the highlights into a really simple story. This is an example of how USA Today papers have a template they can use for something like this, I think. And this is the first time I saw it was this example from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. After protests in Kenosha, they wrote a really fantastic FAQ addressing some misassumptions they were seeing about the language they were using in their coverage, how they were covering people accused of crimes, victims of crimes. And they took them to sort of a swipeable gallery that got to their most central questions. You can see that the engagement on this was really high. I'm sure they reached a lot of people who don't typically come to their newsroom. They're going to reach people who were not necessarily the ones asking the questions, but were probably also curious about them. So it was things like this. Why aren't you reporting on Jacob Blake's record? Here's why. What about the records of Kyle Rittenhouse? So they were getting a lot of questions about the people involved in this complex situation, and they boiled their answers down into the simplest explanations. The goal there is not necessarily to get people back to the full FAQ, although it's great if you can do that as well. It's to reach people wherever they are, showing that there was thoughtfulness and consistency behind your decision making. So let's talk about how much time this all takes. Shall we do that? Because it is perfectly valid. If your response to all of this, if you were sitting there thinking this is great and all, but my team has no time for this sort of thing, and all of this is going to take a lot of work, you are not wrong that you are overworked and understaffed, and that this stuff does take extra time. The good news is that there is a lot you can do to become more efficient over time. So some of the ways that we see newsrooms do that are to the same way that the audience forgets when you've written FAQs and gotten on the record about things, your staff actually forgets to link back to it. They forget that they can borrow from the language. So the goal was something like this. If you explain your election coverage, the goal would be for the staff to really rely on that language. Because if a reporter out in the field gets a complaint, or if somebody moderating social comments sees an accusation, coming up with the language from scratch is exhausting. It could be really problematic because not everyone is empowered to speak on behalf of the brand in that way, right? Once your boss has signed off on language saying, yes, here is how and why we're going to cover this, man, take advantage of that. So remind the staff routinely, this is language you can use. When the staff does take time to say, here's why we did this investigation, here is how much time we spent on this, here's why we highlighted this source, here is other coverage we've done about this. Anytime that explanation could be reused, think about where you could create that repository of language. Does your newsroom keep a Google Doc, which some newsrooms do? Does your newsroom have a Slack channel where you're going to say, hey, if anyone asks you about this, here's some language that Joe signed off on that it's okay to use again, right? Also, think about how you could make them public. It might be that you take time responding to an email and think, man, the next time, gosh, this happens so often, doesn't it? It happens to all of us that you're trying to decide, it's the end of your day, you're trying to decide whether to write back to someone. And you're like, no, you know what? I'm going to write back. And you spend 15 minutes crafting a really thoughtful email to write back to one person. And then a week later, somebody asks you for it again. So when you can, think, is that something we should add to our FAQ? Or is that something we should make an Instagram gallery about? Or is that something we should make a standalone social post on saying, we got asked by a reader XYZ. Here's our staff's response to that. Think about how any effort put into explaining your work could make you more efficient over time. I'm sure we'll have questions about that. So if you have questions about how to work this into your routines in your newsroom, we'd love to talk about that in just a minute. So the more you are on the record, the easier it is to respond when things come up in the moment. The word we use for this at Trusting News a lot is counter narrative. When people have an accusation, what is your counter narrative? If people went and searched your website or your about page or your socials for an explanation of how you work to be fair, why you have a paywall, anything, where is your explanation? And once you have it, moving forward, it gets a lot easier. So one way to get buy-in for this kind of work, if you are trying to think about how in the world am I going to talk my political reporters or my boss into this idea that we need to invest time in writing these explanations, one way to get buy-in is to connect it to the mission and connect it to the goals of your colleagues or of your bosses. So think about the problems you can solve for other people. Think about being able to say to a colleague, when someone complains about this, how great would it feel to have an explanation ready? Think about the boss who has to field the most angry emails from people and how helpful it would be to have that. Think also about the mission statement for your democracy coverage specifically, or for your organization overall. Think about being able to say, hey, this part where it says we're a public service and we help our community deliberate about tough topics. People don't trust us to do that. They don't think that we do that. It seems like it would be really useful to articulate, here's how we do that and here's what that looks like. so that we're able to then sort of get credit, tie it back to the mission. Think about what people, if you're a membership organization or a subscription organization, think about what people say when they cancel subscriptions or cancel recurring donations. Think about being able to say to someone in your organization, look, if somebody calls and has this complaint, here's what I would love to say back to them, or be able to email them after they've canceled and have someone in the newsroom or hand the language over to someone in that department who could say, actually, this is a, just to make sure you have all the information, here's our commitment to that, and here's what that looks like. So just to end our examples on a light note, I want to remind you what we said up top, that not everybody is reachable, all right? So this is a funny exchange that a former news director, Mike Cannon at WCPO, had with somebody in their Facebook comments. She says, you have to just dive into this and cry a little bit. How do you determine your stories to be run? Are they straight off the AP or do you fact check them? So Mike gives a really simple explanation first. We do not have the ability to fact check stories that come from our news partners. We look to news partners like the AP because we think you need the news, right? And then she says, that explains a lot why you just throw things out there. You have no real journalists. You just follow the sheet, right? And so he's like, oh, we're starting there. She didn't get this at all. So then he says, we fact check local stories. We have an entire team of hardworking journalists who do that. We do not fact check the AP, and then somebody else jumps right back in, right? So they're not always going to get it. These people really do believe that if the independent journalists at WCPO are not re-reporting AP stories, that they must not be doing their jobs. So it is really tempting to just walk away from things like this. However, they get hundreds of comments on their Facebook page, and those posts are read by thousands of people. So Mike taking time to get on the record about why they run AP coverage and what their local team of journalists does and does not do, what the scope of that is, the easier. That means that they're not letting Janet have the last word about why they run those stories and how they operate as a news team. Of course, there are ways to explain that the time of your local staff is best spent in other ways. But people don't understand how that works. And you know what? It's reasonable for them not to understand it, because there's a lot about how other industries work that I do not understand as well. So before we stop for some comments, let me just share a few links with you. As part of Democracy Day, Lynn and I are offering one-on-one coaching sessions. If you would like to work on an FAQ, we would love to help you. If you want help brainstorming the questions or deciding which questions are most important to answer, we can help you at that stage in the process. If you are going to work on one and you want some feedback on the language, we're happy to do that as well. All these links will come around in a follow-up email from Joe. But in case you want to grab them, they are first come, first served. So there's a Calendly link there to sign up for one of our spots. We have a weekly email called Trust Tips that we send once a week. That is one quick actionable tip for earning trust, often with an example from a newsroom of how they're doing it. So we invite you to sign up there. We have a new series of resources called Trust Kits that we're rolling out this summer. They are step-by-step guides to things like transparency and there's a trust kit on what transparency looks like in day-to-day coverage. There's the trust kit on earning trust with sources. Some of our most foundational strategies that we've been developing since 2016. That is where you can find those. We also try to practice what we preach in the same way that we invite newsrooms to seek feedback. We enjoy it as well. We'd also love to keep in touch with you. So this is a quick feedback form if you want to tell us if anything stood out about this and if it was useful to you, and also whether you'd appreciate us checking in the future and seeing how your efforts to earn trust are doing. And email addresses are here as well. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. And I'm going to stop share so we can go back to conversation mode.
All right. Absolutely incredible. And I spent the last 15 minutes just trying to frantically include all of these links and everything you're sending for our recap email. So it's going to be a thick one when we get the recap. So thank you both so much. We have a couple of questions and discussion topics in the chat. I do want to give everybody a chance. We're going to drop the spotlights and everything right now and just sort of have a conversation. So I want to give everybody a chance to ask anything out loud. You can go ahead and use the raise hand feature down below and raise your hand and we'll call on you. I'm going to drop the spotlights now. And now we're all just people in a gallery, So Go ahead and raise your hand now if you want to ask a question. You should be able to unmute once I call on you. Anybody want to kick us off? If not, I can go through the chat really quick and we can go back to anything. Or Joy and Lynn, if you had anything you wanted to touch on that you saw that was interesting in the chat, you didn't get a chance to.
There was one question as people are maybe thinking of what they may want to ask, they're curious about. There was one question, I answered it with text, but I think Joy, maybe if you have other thoughts on it, was a couple different people asked about the language that some of the explainers from the newsrooms used versus covering fairly, covering equally, covering with equity. And, what I explained is from a trusting news perspective, we don't tell journalists what language to use, but we do talk about the importance of the language that you use, how they should be thinking carefully about it and explaining word choice, because those are things that can definitely contribute to people thinking there is a bias and or in some cases maybe not understanding or not reading the content. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else, Joy, to that about those words specifically.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that there's not a one-size-fits-all way to cover elections and democracy, right? In some newsrooms, there might be a deep commitment to equal coverage. Like, I have put together voters guides where we were counting words about the profile, the experience, how many words we give each people to explain their stances on things, and it was laid out on a grid, and the whole thing was everybody has equal opportunity to reach the audience, right? That might be, that kind of voters guide focus might be something that applies to your coverage more generally. Other people might cover specific issues more, or specific communities more, and the candidates who are speaking directly to those issues or those communities might get more coverage. So I think the real issue is being able to articulate things that otherwise stay internal. So whatever, if you're in the kind of newsroom where you're not just diving in and flailing about, if you're having conversations that says, here's how we're going to decide the best way to cover this and which issues to focus on and which candidates to focus on, that whatever you decide internally, you also share publicly.
So I while we wait for other questions, I love all the stuff you do, and I know that there's those edge cases that I think somebody in the chat brought up a while back. Is there a point, or do you talk to newsrooms who have sort of reached a threshold? A lot of what you do it assumes good faith, and intentionally so assumes good faith. But is there a threshold at which, or a certain way or manner in which the feedback or questions from community members comes in that you've seen folks set up a standard like, this is not worth our time? I know you said we can't convince everybody. And we don't feel compelled to do those kinds of audits and look and count do word counts on flat earth or things like, outright fascism. Because I think when people do or hear about these kind of workshops and they think like, they just hear, oh, let's everybody, both sides, like, all the people who want to eradicate trans people and the people who don't want that to happen, let's meet somewhere in the middle. Like, I'm sure you've gotten that question a million times. What are newsrooms doing to sort of buffer that and set those standards?
Yeah, I mean, the question, of course, is it's hard to know. We don't always know where somebody is on sort of the playing field of facts and what's reasonable and what's not. And how do we decide that without blowing off people, while still providing on-ramps to facts? So who is so lost in the world of conspiracy theories and hate that they're not reachable, and who maybe is hearing a lot of things that are very confusing and sound compelling to them, but is still reachable if we give them a way into the content, into the facts. So I think that my threshold in terms of when to respond varies greatly depending on the platform. I have a high threshold in terms of response when it's private. So you have no obligation to respond, especially more than once, to angry people in your voicemail or your inbox, right? Delete. And I also think that it's important in public-facing communications to have really solid policies. So, man, I hope that if you're moderating comments, you have a policy that empowers you to ban people. Just ban them, like outright, without any response if needed. Or, if it's a little bit hard to tell and you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, you go back and forth once, man, get rid of them, delete comments and ban if not. What I try to recognize with public-facing comments is if somebody is not outright violating our policy, and they're asking a question that other people might have in mind more generously, choose the generous way to respond.
Fantastic. Thank you. We have two questions. We have Bernardo. Bernardo, you go ahead, and then Jerry, you're up next.
Thank you. That's actually made me remind of something that I seen a while ago, I think, but I don't even know exactly where. But this journalist who went to a specific place where people were very distrusting of news, and he actually sat with people who were doubting his work and just say, okay, how are you doing your research? And then he sat with his laptop and the other person was their laptop and just checked everything they were doing and going explaining how he was doing his research and finding the facts and checking the sources and everything else. And that made me think about what the process that we try to use, because I think a lot of what you're saying here is actually to kind of help, especially definitely newsrooms are much larger than mine, but to make things a little bit easier on them. So a lot of these tools that you put out there are very helpful in that way. But in the same way, there is this threshold that you've mentioned that sometimes you're not going to break that threshold with nothing that you put online or even on the newspaper or on video. You're only going to be able to do that when you actually sit face to face with that person. And think about Democracy Day. Wouldn't that be an interesting project for Democracy Day to start thinking, maybe part of this is to get a way to support newsrooms to put their new reporters with those people who are not in any way trying to believe the news, and start thinking, where does that come from? And how can we at least establish communication? It doesn't have to be convincing them, but at least establish this conversation.
I think that would be absolutely amazing. And so with a lot of the examples that we showed, a lot of this is digital, right? I mean, that's what a lot of these examples are. They're a way to reach people who are consuming digital news and or even print or on air. But there is nothing better and that replaces in-person communication. The main problem for a lot of newsrooms with that is that's very time consuming. I think that's what we have found. But we have worked with newsrooms to do like basically listening projects where they have committed to reaching out to people and having phone calls about what they think about news, what they think about news coverage, their opinions of what's going on in the community, not asking for story ideas, just asking them, what do you think about it? And the experience for both the news consumer and the journalist was so positive. They both loved it. The journalists learned so much. They felt it made their reporting better. And so the kind of example of what you were talking about, I think that would be amazing for more newsrooms to do. And the key is, okay, for that to happen, journalists are busier than ever. The key is how do you work that into and make it part of the person's job? That's the key. So if you're a manager and you want this to happen, make that a requirement. They have to do this maybe once a month or one day a month. They just go out and they sit in a neighborhood, they knock on doors, they talk with people, right? They ask questions. That kind of thing is just invaluable and such a great way to build trust. And I think a fantastic idea.
Hey, Lynn, you know what else that made me think about? Was it a Charlotte TV station that was it Andy who did that post about like bringing on a skeptical news consumer after the election?
Yeah, Atlanta. So Andy Periotti at 11 Alive did a whole series actually where it's the Tegna station there. The 3 topics, it was something with the vaccine. One was someone who didn't believe the election results, and I'm forgetting what the third was, but basically he found someone who either was against vaccines or in the case didn't believe the election results that Biden won. That person then got to interview the experts that Andy would have used, the reporter in the stories. And they filmed all of it, published all of it, and talked to the person as they went through the process. And so I'll find that link and share it. But that's an example of then they used it for news content. So I think, Bernardo, what you're talking about is that's a great thing to do. You can turn that into news content. And that's what they did. They turned it into a series that was well done. And I think, it did take a lot of time, but definitely was helpful for that person involved, but then also their friends or anyone else.
The other benefit of spending time in those kinds of conversations is that it gives you more empathy and understanding for where you need to meet people to have your coverage relevant. So one example I'll share is we've done a lot of work with the Times Free Press in Chattanooga. And, when we first started to work with them around the time of the last election, they said 82% of their coverage area had voted for Trump and that there was a high degree of election skepticism. And they said, we can ignore that. And all that does is send them to further right news sources and weaken our subscription base. Like, we'll go out of business. It's terrible for democracy. Like, how does that help anything if we don't try to be found reasonable by them? And so they definitely did not pander or water down the facts, but they started to include more context in the reporting that would give people an on-ramp. So let me give you an example of a quick on-ramp from the Chattanooga folks. If they got a story from the Associated Press that said, that included a phrase like Trump's baseless claims about the integrity of the 2020 election, they understood their audience enough to know that that would feel like an opinion to a lot of people in their coverage area. That the fact that the election was actually, that Trump's concerns were baseless would feel like an opinion. So they didn't take it out, but they added a paragraph to the stories that said, according to audits done by Republican state officials in these areas, here's sort of XYZ about why we know the election was fair. Not going to persuade everybody, but it brings the receipts for that claim, and it makes it more likely that if people's minds are open at all, that they're going to find it. And I think that is that giving people that on-ramp instead of giving up on them is important. I would invite any other questions or ideas around that. I think that's important.
Okay, Jerry has been waiting patiently. Jerry, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I think I'm off mute. Thanks for this. It's been really great as far as macro standards. I was actually wanting to invert this in the sense that I've been animated by the fact that a number of practitioners who are on the Supreme Court beat, beginning with Dia Lithwick and about 6 people, have spent the year since Dobbs being transparently thinking about reimagining their beat. And it has been reflected on how they covered the end of the session. And the opposite of that is when you read the day before affirmative action, how many traditional Supreme Court reporters, Adam Nangaroni, Nita Tonenberg, were immediately falling back to the so-called center about Roberts is moderating the court. And then, of course, there was affirmative action in 303. So I'm wondering, you guys, anyone wants to take this, how can what they're doing be a model on the beat level of people having a bit of humility and thinking about, are we doing this right? What worked even a year ago, is it no longer working? And how can we follow, because I've been following it closely, how can we follow what they're thinking of rebuilding to inform journalism? Thanks.
That's a good question. I think that, so first let me say that we also are not the same as with the previous question. Like, our role here is not to come in and say, here's how the Supreme Court should be covered, that there's a one size fits all answer for everybody. I think that that's a great example though, Jerry, of how newsrooms have to decide what their angle is going to be, what their lens is going to be on this topic, what they're going to accept as up for debate and what not, whose voices they're going to center, and what they're going to sort of accept as fact versus worthy of analysis, what context it's important to them to bring. And those are all things that are usually invisible. So I think if you are going to say I wish we do this as we cover election security and Trump more often, think through the way we've been doing this has not worked, and have the discipline internally to articulate, here's how we would have done this, and here's how we're going to do it differently. What does that actually mean? Does that mean that when people make an outlandish claim, you're not going to cover it? Does that mean that you are going to you're going to have context ready to insert into stories that frames an issue in a certain way, and have that ready to go, so that you, both because it holds you accountable for doing it, it clears up confusion if your coverage looks different than how other people are covering something, or it looks different from previous coverage. It invites people to hold you accountable for those changes and consistently, so that when people say, why are you doing this? That's ridiculous and new and different and I hate it. You can say, it's okay if you hate it, but here's where we articulated how we're gonna do this differently. And we took time to get on the record about it when someone wasn't yelling at us, when we weren't when we weren't on deadline, so that we can kind of have a narrative that makes sense. I don't know, Lynn, if you had anything to add about that.
Ethics chair for the Society of Professional Journalists and think about ethics a lot when it comes to this. And I think, again, there are lots of debate around the coverage and kind of equal coverage, fair coverage, lots of different definitions and things those could mean. I think it's really important for your news organization to decide what is our goal with the coverage and who are we trying to reach. If you are trying to reach your whole community, you are going to have a different approach than if you say, I only care about reaching people who already are pro-choice or who already are pro LGBTQ rights. Like that's a stance I'm willing to take. If you are going to take those stance, I think that is fine. You just need to be transparent about that intention and about that goal. That transparency is key always. And it should be something that is spelled out clearly and mentioned in every story that you do. Because what's going to happen is that for a lot of kind of mainstream news organizations, they do try to serve everyone, right? So they are not, your coverage then is going to look very different than what the local TV station probably is, who is trying to cover and serve everyone. So someone's going to see something that's different, make an assumption that you have a bias or an agenda. And in this case, actually, you might. That's okay. Get on the record about it. Be transparent. Make sure that's clear. So when the news consumer is consuming it, they understand that's where you're coming from. And that's what you're trying to achieve. That's what you're pushing for. And again, debates can go on and on about how this should be done, what's the best way to do it. The key, I really think from a trust standpoint, everything we learn, be transparent, and from an ethical standpoint, I think it's just so important. We don't want to trick or try to act like we're covering or producing content for everyone if really that's not our goal. We're really trying to convince someone of something. If that's the goal, say that, make sure that's clear.
And consistency, right? Because that's a lot of what ethics policies are about, is that we're not making this decision in the moment based on how we feel about this issue or based on who's on duty today. We have a consistent approach. I would love to take Kurt's question in the chat as the last one. Joe, you said we have time for one more?
Yep.
Awesome. So the question of making comments about other news outlets' standards was Kurt's question. Do you touch on that, or do you stick to your own organization's story? So I have strong feelings that public service should be at the heart of what we're doing, and that news outlets are missing a huge opportunity to help people navigate the news. That basic principle that consuming the news is really confusing, deciding what is credible and what is not is hard, understanding where different organizations are coming from, what is responsible, ethical journalism, and what is something else, what is an individual person's opinion, which is fine, that's an important part of our information climate, and what is sort of more traditional journalism. So when you want to point out less responsible or less thoughtful approaches from another organization, I think the question is, are you actually doing that to help the public, or are you doing it is it a gotcha move, or is it a here's why we're so much better move? Not that it's bad to show why you're better, right? And so we certainly have worked newsrooms through issues like this where they say, I can't believe every other news organization in town is just taking these names of people straight off the scanner and spamming the community with it, and it's causing a bunch of trouble, right? And so if you want to say other news organizations, or even one is doing this, here's what makes us different, I think that's fine. The example we showed you from a TV station in Iowa saying nobody at Gray TV has ever told us what to cover, that was actually in response to a video that was circulating at Sinclair stations where the corporate office had said, we need every station to voice this message, right? And so they were using it. It was kind of a dig to other stations. Here's what other people do, and we don't operate that way. But it also was a chance to say, they did it without name calling Sinclair, but it's a chance to say, here's what to look out for, and here's why what we're doing is different. So if it's going to help people consume the news and differentiate between what you think of as responsible, thoughtful journalism and otherwise, then I think it's fair game.
All right. Well, Absolutely fantastic across the board. Lots to think about. Thank you all so much to everybody who participated today. Everyone who registered, as I said before, will get a link to the recording along with like 58 different links to resources and examples from today. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Lynn. Fantastic. Just really, really great. And I'll let everybody know. I'll send out that email as soon as the recording is done processing. You'll also get a transcript, rough auto-generated transcript in case you want to use any of this in your reporting, or if you want to write something up. If you do write something up, send it to us. We'd love to know and share and help promote it and share it with our network. So take care, everybody, and sign up for Democracy Day. Go to usdemocracyday.org and become a reporting partner or a supporter and help keep this admittedly shaky ship afloat for a little bit longer. So thanks, folks. We'll see you later.